Good evening. How is everyone today? Well, we are so excited to have you all here. This is the Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Really the first time we've ever sponsored an event like this, where we're addressing a very current, controversial topic from some really different perspectives. This is the Scholars and Students Discuss Marijuana, Neuroscience, History, Public Policy, and more, in case you were not quite sure if you were in the right place. Right, that's where we are. But our purpose this evening is to really challenge everyone here to think about a current controversial topic, in our case marijuana, from some really different kinds of perspectives than maybe you have in the past, as well as what you're learning in all of your different kinds of classes that you're taking this semester. Tonight we're going to have four different speakers, four different experts who are going to talk about marijuana from some very different scholarly perspectives. We have a historian, we have a neuroscientist, we have a mathematician, and we have a philosopher who are going to really approach this from just very different kinds of angles. And then after our speakers present their information, we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So I ask that you hold all of your questions and answers until we get to that portion of our presentation. And then at the close, I'm going to come back up and talk with everyone. A lot of y'all are here tonight. Our students are here, and your instructors have offered to give you some extra credit for participating in this opportunity. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what you'll need to do in order to receive that extra credit. That being said, if you do absolutely have to leave early, please make sure you email your instructor as soon as possible. For everyone else, you'll sign up at the end of the entire presentation, and we have a sheet of questions for you to pick up in order for you to complete that. It's really important that you make sure your instructor was willing to offer the extra credit, so you want to double check with that. And I want to start us off with Tom Duty, who's a Wake Tech instructor of history, and he's going to share with us his perspective. So thank you so much.
Good evening. I'll be doing the history part of the marijuana speech. The very mention of the name marijuana to some conjures up images of stoned hippies slogging through rain-drenched mud for a rock concert in Woodstock, New York in 1969. For younger people, it might conjure up other kinds of images. To some people, marijuana is seen as evil incarnate, the prime gateway to harder drugs, such as heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and crack. Technically known as cannabis sativa, marijuana has been around probably as long as, or longer than mankind. The earliest record of man's use of cannabis comes from the island of Taiwan, located off the coast of mainland China. In this densely populated part of the world, archaeologists have unearthed an ancient village site dating back over 10,000 years to the Stone Age. Scattered among the trash and debris from this prehistoric community were some broken pieces of pottery, the sides of which had been decorated by pressing strips of cord into the wet clay before it hardened. Also dispersed among the pottery fragments were some elongated rod-shaped tools, very similar in appearance to those later used to loosen cannabis fibers from their stems. These simple pots with their patterns of twisted fiber embedded in their sides suggest that men have been using the marijuana plant in some manner since the dawn of history. It is important to distinguish between the two familiar subspecies of the cannabis plant, a leading expert, Barney Whorf, has said. Cannabis sativa, known as marijuana, has psychoactive properties. Formerly christened as cannabis sativa in 1753 by Carl Linnaeus, marijuana is one of nature's hardiest specimens. The other plant is Cannabis sativa L, and the L was designated from Carl Linnaeus as well, the botanist of ancient times. This subspecies is known as hemp, the Cannabis L. It is a non-psychoactive form of cannabis and is used in manufacturing products such as oil, cloth, and fuel. Hemp has been an associate and a byproduct of marijuana since the beginning of time as well, so they've gone hand in hand. Some sources date the weaving of hemp fiber to more than 10,000 years ago. Others uses of the fiber have been carbon dated to 8,000 BCE. In Great Britain, the cultivation of hemp goes back to 800 CE. During the 16th century, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I advocated the planting of hemp to equip the British naval fleet with various materials such as pennants, rigging, sails, and oakum, rope used on ships, all coming from hemp fiber and oil. Paper from hemp was essential for maps, logs, and for Bibles that the sailors carried with them. Marijuana's first recorded use for medicinal purposes dates back to 4000 BCE. The herb was used, for instance, as an anesthetic during surgery. And stories say it was even used by the Chinese Emperor Sheng Nung in 2737 BCE, though nobody was there. Pot, where was I? Right, threw me off for a second. Pot from China traveled to Korea about 2000 BCE, while an Indo-European group, the Aryans, brought marijuana to the South Asian subcontinent around 1500 BCE. People in India celebrated herb as one of the 5 kingdoms of herbs, which release us from anxiety. Could use some now. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's not about that. It's just... The Scythians, a nomadic Indo-European group, probably used cannabis that was brought to the Middle East from about 2000 BCE to 1400 BCE. Everybody's got to get those terms right. The Scythians also likely carried the drug into southeast Russia and Ukraine. Germanic tribes introduced the drug into Germany, and marijuana traveled from there to Britain during the 5th century, along with the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Might have helped, I don't know. Throughout the next several centuries, cannabis migrated to various regions of the world, moving through Africa, reaching South America during the 19th century, and being carried north later, eventually reaching North America. Cannabis made its way to the US at the beginning of the 20th century. It came to the southwestern United States from Mexico. As immigrants fled the Mexican Revolution of 1910 or 1911. American laws never recognized the difference between cannabis sativa L and cannabis sativa. The plant was first outlawed in Utah in 1915, and by 1931 it was illegal in 29 states. In 1930, Harry Anslinger became the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and undertook multiple efforts to make marijuana illegal in all states. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act put cannabis under the regulation of the Drug Enforcement Agency, criminalizing possession of the plant throughout the country. And that ties in with hemp as well. Today, the federal government still classified marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance along with heroin and LSD. Indication that it has high potential for abuse and addiction. No accepted medical uses and no safe level of use is what some of the sources say. The pot and hemp connection, as has been mentioned earlier, marijuana and hemp have kind of evolved together. Although cannabis, the sativa L or hemp, contains less than 1% of THC or tetrahydrocannabinol. The main psychoactive ingredient in marijuana has still come under the restrictions of the government, the DEA. Various parts of the plant can be utilized in the making of textiles, paper, plants, paint, clothing, plastics, cosmetics, foodstuffs, wow, insulation, animal feed, and other products. Hemp produces a much higher yield per acre than do some common substitutes such as cotton and requires few pesticides. In addition, hemp has an average growing cycle of only 100 days and leaves the soil virtually weed-free for the next planting. Hemp is an ancient plant that has been cultivated for millennia. The Columbia History of the World states that the weaving of hemp fiber began over 2,000 years ago. Carbon tests have suggested that the use of wild hemp dates as far back as 8,000 BCE. To the Hindu, the hemp plant is holy. In Great Britain, hemp cultivation, as I mentioned earlier, dates back at least to Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, and you could actually be imprisoned if you didn't grow hemp, like the opposite of what it is today. And they use it for the naval fleet. Hemp paper was used for maps, I mentioned that. 17th century American farmers in Virginia, Massachusetts, and Connecticut were ordered by law to grow Indian hemp. By the early 18th century, a person could be sentenced to jail if they weren't growing hemp on their land. Hemp was considered to be legal tender. For over 200 years in colonial America, hemp was currency with which one could pay his taxes. I'm going to try that. We're going to try hemp send that through the mail. The 1850 U.S. Census documented approximately 8,400 hemp plantations of at least 2,000 acres. Strains in cultivation included China hemp, Smyrna hemp, and Japanese hemp. Those are the ones I could find. Hemp fuel. Hemp has a great history with fuel and the early kind of inventors of the internal combustion engine, Rudolf Diesel. In 1896, Diesel had produced his famous engine. Like many others, Diesel assumed that the diesel engine would be powered by a variety of fuels. Ford wanted to use peanut oil originally. Henry Ford of the Ford Motor Company saw the potential of biomass fuels. Ford engineers extracted methanol, charcoal fuel, tar pitch, ethyl acetate, and creosote, fundamental ingredients for modern industry. So they're all trying to use these non-fossil fuels. The most commonly seen modern hemp product is clothing. Woody Harrelson, if you've seen him lately, he probably has a whole outfit of hemp on him. Those who know Woody Harrelson. The most commonly seen modern hemp product is the hemp clothing is warmer, softer, more absorbent, extremely breathable, and significantly longer lasting than clothing made from cotton. It is nice to have clothing that looks like linen, feels like flannel, and wears 2 to 3 times longer than other fabrics. The seeds are an excellent nutritional source that can provide quality fats and proteins. Wow. The hemp seed oil is utilized for its healing qualities in many salves and cosmetics, but can also be used to create, like I mentioned, paint, varnishes, and lubricants. I also should be doing hemp or something. Henry Ford's famous quote about hemp: "Why use up the forests which were centuries in the making and mines, which requires ages to lay down, if we can get the equivalent of forest and mineral products in the annual growth of hemp fields?" From 1937, as I mentioned, until the late 60s, the US government recognized that industrial hemp and marijuana were 2 distinct varieties of the cannabis plant. After the Controlled Substance Act was passed, hemp was no longer recognized as being distinct from marijuana. A little bit about medicinal marijuana. Is everybody still following me? Too stoned. Oh, and you were giving me the kind of... all right. Remember that next Monday, yes. Tomorrow. Medical marijuana is legal in 23 states, the District of Columbia and Guam, if you're ever in Guam. And recreational use of the drug is legal in Washington State and Colorado. Marijuana's medicinal uses can be traced back as early as its recreational uses back to Taiwan and China, Shenyang again. It was touted as a treatment for gout, rheumatism, malaria, and even poor memory, writes Mitch Earlywine, a professor of psychology at the State University of New York. William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish doctor, popularized the medical use of cannabis in England and America after noting its effects in India. Medical marijuana is available in several different forms. It can be smoked, vaporized, ingested in a pill form, or an edible version can be added to foods such as brownies, cookies, and chocolate bars. That's what it says here, anyway. The idea that marijuana may have therapeutic effects is rooted in solid science, my source said. Marijuana contains 60 active ingredients known as cannabinoids. The body naturally makes its own form of cannabinoids to modulate pain, says Donald Abrams, an integrative medicine specialist for cancer patients at the University of California, so he should know. The primary cannabinoid in marijuana is THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol. Exactly. THC targets the receptor found primarily in the brain, but also in the nervous system, liver, kidneys, and lungs. The CBI receptor is activated to quiet the response to pain or noxious chemicals. Researchers at the American Academy of Neurology have also found that medical marijuana in the form of pills or oral sprays seem to reduce stiffness and muscle spasm in MS or multiple sclerosis. The medications also ease certain symptoms of MS, such as pain related to spasms and painful burning and numbness, as well as overactive bladder, according to studies published in the journal Neurology. HIV and AIDS patients have been helped by the marijuana's appetite stimulation, and chemotherapy patients have been treated for nausea by using marijuana. Okay, wrapping it up here. By 1937, mentioned that, again, the Marijuana Tax Act imposed such high taxes on physicians prescribing cannabis, retail pharmacists selling cannabis, and those cultivating medical cannabis, that is, essentially fell out of favor as a treatment. Marijuana, legal or decriminalized? Colorado and Washington are the two main states that have legalized marijuana for recreational and medicinal use. Other states have allowed cannabis used for strictly medicinal purposes, while others are struggling for decriminalization for both recreational and medicinal uses. We've heard a lot in the media lately about decriminalization in DC and in North Carolina, and some media outlets have kind of given us information that might be misleading. The specifics of the law in the DC are yet to be really clarified, and so we don't know for sure if it's only legal if you grow it, is what one of my sources has told me. Not told me, but right, a dealer. Not at my age. In North Carolina, some media say that marijuana is decriminalized, but if you possess more than an ounce and a half, you can be charged with a felony. So I don't think that's decriminalization. And I wanted to just mention one thing, keep the mic in front of me, about the House of Representatives in North Carolina killed the medicinal marijuana bill yesterday. So I just wanted to mention that as far as the history. So that's my speech. Thank you.
Okay, so what is marijuana? Tom has talked a little bit about this, but most of us associate marijuana. We see a marijuana leaf, and that's marijuana, or the dried plant. And he also mentioned hemp, which is the high-growing type of cannabis plant. Most of the psychoactive ingredients, however, are located within the flowering marijuana plant, which is the female plant, and it's located in the resin that is put out by the flower. And this hashish, if you've ever heard that term, that's the kind of purified resin that's in the cannabis plant, and it has very, very high concentration of THC, and this is hashish oil. So these are kind of the pictures you might associate with marijuana. Or perhaps you've heard about it more with smoking. Smoking is one way of inhaling marijuana. More recently, we see marijuana that's been used in e-cigarette-like containers and vaporized. And then, as Tom mentioned, we have many, many edibles, and these tend to be more favored by people that are using the plant medicinally. Okay, so what is marijuana? The type that we're most concerned with when we're talking about the brain is cannabis sativa or cannabis indica. And here's a picture of cannabis sativa. And cannabis contains many different cannabinoids. Any chemicals that are in cannabinoids are called, in the cannabis plant are called cannabinoids. And one of the primary psychoactive ingredients is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. Now, most of the research that you've heard about cannabis, or particularly animal research, what they're really looking at is the effects of this chemical, not the whole cannabis plant. So when you're reading particularly animal research, that's what you're looking at, is what does this chemical within the plant do? Okay, so some of the effects of marijuana are altered states of consciousness, altered time perception. Time seems to slow down and you get a slowed reaction time. Short-term memory deficits, tachycardia, fast heartbeat, analgesia, which essentially means pain relief, and marijuana may also have anti-inflammatory properties. Some that you might be familiar with is increased appetite, or the munchies, and then the reddening of eyes is also one of the pharmacological effects of marijuana. So I'm going to spend all of my time today talking about marijuana, or THC, in the brain. Keep in mind when I'm talking about this, though, is that THC has a lot of effects also in the body. And I'm not really going to talk about that, but there are a lot of effects in the body also. But in the brain, THC reaches all different portions of the brain, and it's particularly reaches parts that are involved with movement, judgment, reward, memory, coordination, and sensations, particularly touch. It's also very lipophilic, which means that it loves fats, which means that it crosses into the brain very easily. It crosses the blood-brain barrier very easily, gets into the brain, and can act there. So how does THC act in the brain? Well, basically, the way that it acts is there are receptors in the brain, which are basically proteins that are embedded in the membrane, and THC acts at one of these receptors known as the CB1 receptor. There are also CB2 receptors that are primarily in the body where it acts, but like I said, in the brain it's CB1 receptor, and what THC does is it binds to this receptor on the outside and causes some changes in the inside, a whole cascade of effects on the inside of the cell. This picture here is a picture of, if you took this receptor and you stretched it out, that's what it would look like. So if you ever see that in one of your classes, this is what the receptor looks like if it's stretched out. So THC is what we call an agonist, in that it fits into the receptor and it activates the receptor. One thing about THC versus other, one thing about THC is very long-acting, so it binds to this receptor and it stays there for quite a while. Now, you might say, well, why are we, why do we have these receptors? Obviously, evolution wasn't just waiting around for a plant to come along and we, us to abuse it. Essentially, the reason that we have receptors is that there's a natural chemical that acts at this receptor, a hormone or a neurotransmitter. And in the case of THC, or cannabinoids, there actually are what we call endocannabinoids. These are endogenous cannabinoids, kind of like endogenous opioids that create a runner's high. And so these endocannabinoids, the first was discovered by scientist Dr. Bill Devane when he was studying in Israel as a postdoc. And essentially, he was looking at pig brain from a local butcher, and he was looking at different kinds of chemicals contained in there, and he discovered a chemical called arachidonyl ethanolamide, or anandamide, and this was the first identified endogenous cannabinoid. And the reason that he named it anandamide was at the time he was studying Sanskrit, and ananda means internal bliss, and amide is the type of chemical it is, so he decided to name it an anandamide. Later, 2-AG, or 2-arachidonyl glycerol, was described, and there are a few more, but those are the two primary endocannabinoids. Okay, so where do they come from? Essentially, the raw materials that form endocannabinoids come from the diet, and they come from fatty acids. So fatty acids are used to synthesize something known as arachidonic acid, which is a component of cell membranes. And arachidonic acid is then synthesized, further synthesized as needed, into anandamide or 2-AG. It also is synthesized into a lot of other lipids that are needed by the body, like aspirin works by interrupting the arachidonic acid pathway. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters in general. Neurotransmitters, most of them are anterograde, which what that means is that when the signal comes from the brain cell and it travels down the neuron, it gets to the axon, and then it releases packets of neurotransmitters that are contained in little sacs called vesicles. The neurotransmitter is released when it gets a signal, and it diffuses across the synapse, the gap here, and it activates the postsynaptic receptor. So it binds to receptors that are located on the dendrite, and it may activate the neuron postsynaptically. Okay, that's the way that typical neurotransmitters act, like dopamine or epinephrine. However, endocannabinoids act differently. They're what's known as retrograde neurotransmitters. So what they do is, rather than being released from the presynaptic neuron, they're released from the postsynaptic neuron, usually as in response to something that's happening here. So say this neuron is releasing too much neurotransmitter, these receptors, these neurons will be activated and will release anandamide or 2-AG, which travels back to this receptor and modulates what's going on at the receptor. That's called retrograde neurotransmission or neuromodulation. Okay, so it's kind of like this. Say you have glutamate. Glutamate is an excitatory neurotransmitter. When glutamate's present, the neuron's going go, 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 go. So kind of like this, go, 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 go. If that happens too much, the endocannabinoid system may be triggered. And what will happen is anandamide, which is the neurotransmitter associated with glutamate, will be synthesized, released, and travel to the presynaptic cell, the CB1 receptor, where it will have an inhibitory effect. So essentially what it's going to do is say, take your foot off the accelerator, slow down. So it's inhibitory on that excitatory effect. Once it's had that effect and it's slowed down the glutamate receptors, you know, it will kind of disappear. It will be reabsorbed into the cell, and then it will be metabolized by something known as fatty acid amide hydrolase. So the raw materials get recycled. Okay. We also have endocannabinoids associated with GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and 2-AG is associated primarily with GABA. Now, when GABA starts being released here, what it's saying to this neuron is stop, stop, stop. Then comes 2-AG, if that signal gets too strong, and it comes to the presynaptic cell. Its effect is still inhibitory. So what happens if you have an inhibitory effect on an inhibitory effect is basically it's saying, get your foot off the brake. And it'll slow down the release of GABA. Okay, again, once it's done with its job, it's reabsorbed into the cell, and it's metabolized by something known as monoacylglycerol lipase, or MAG lipase. Okay, so it's recycled. Okay, cannabinoid receptors are located throughout the brain. As you might think, because of its variety of different types of psychological and physiological effects. Its primary purpose, if you will, is to kind of bring things back to homeostasis. So it's kind of modulatory and bringing things back to kind of a balance point. And some of the things that its physiological processes that we think endocannabinoids are involved in are things like appetite regulation and energy balance, brain reward system, learning and memory, pain sensation, sleep, and here you can catch one of your instructors perhaps, motor activity and coordination. And one thing to keep in mind, though, and I meant to mention this a little bit earlier, is that endocannabinoid action is very quick. They are released, they're metabolized very, very quickly. THC, when it binds to the receptor, it's going to stay there a while. So that's one big difference between endocannabinoids, very brief action where it's needed, and THC, which gets in, it's going to go all over, and it's pretty long acting. So, kind of to recap, we have a plant that has a psychoactive chemical in it. This chemical mimics endogenous cannabinoids. These cannabinoids act all over the brain and also the body at different receptors. And then here's the presynaptic location. So basically, like I said, they're into maintaining modulation or homeostasis. Okay, so that's kind of my THC cannabinoid talk. One thing, you'll have to indulge me on my soapbox for just a moment, but synthetic cannabinoids like spice, K2, all the things that you've heard there, are not fake marijuana. They look different. You'll see that here. They may interact with the CB1 cannabinoid receptor, but they also act at very many other receptors, perhaps, and so they're very dangerous. We know very, very little about what these chemicals do in the brain or the body. So there's my soapbox speech.
I have to admit, before I get started, that when I saw that I was being referred to as a scholar in this, I was kind of caught off guard. I don't really think of myself as a scholar. More of a scholar wannabe. So I hope that you would all put yourselves in the same category, that you love to learn new things, you're open to new information, and hopefully that's why you're here today. But I love data. That's why I love data so much, is because it teaches you new things. It shows you how to reshape your worldview and to adapt it so it's more accurate, more in touch with objective truth, if I'll let our philosophy guy tell us if we can know that or not. So when I first heard the phrase that was popularized by Mark Twain, that there are 3 types of lies, lies, damned lies, and statistics, my heart was broken. I didn't really understand what that meant, because numbers don't lie. You know, it's kind of like an objective thing, or at least that's how I think of it. Numbers are extremely useful through all of human history. We can use numbers to do things like measure distances in a field and improve agriculture. We can measure aspects of the human body and better understand how much headspace to give somebody in an automobile or something like that. We can measure the metrics for things like physiological processes. And then we can measure how those processes are different when you are under the influence of drugs. And we can make decisions about whether or not these drugs influence us in healthy ways or in unhealthy ways. And those are just numbers. They're objective. They don't have a side. They just kind of are. and it's up to us to do things with them. So, with that in mind, when we think about statistics as a way to lie, what we're really talking about is the tendency in human beings to be deceptive. It's not the numbers that are doing the lying, it's the humans. And so that's why I want you to keep that in mind, that there's nothing inherently evil or deceptive about numbers themselves, but it's very easy, I think, as we'll see in a couple of examples, to use numbers to make some point that may or may not be there. So my first example comes from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. You see this is 2002 PSA for, well, anti-marijuana PSA, and I think it should be loaded already. There it is.
Who were tested for drugs tested positive for marijuana. It's more harmful than we all thought.
Did y'all catch what she said there? It was kind of hard to because of the interesting imagery they were using. So I'm going to back it up. Let's watch it one more time.
Roadside study, 1 in 3 reckless drivers who were tested for drugs tested positive for marijuana. It's more harmful than we all thought.
Yeah, boom, crash, right? So what did she say again? Did y'all catch that? Okay, so you caught it. Here it is, in case you missed it. In a roadside study, 1 in 3 reckless drivers who were tested for drugs tested positive for marijuana. And then she follows that up with some sort of maybe logical statement. Therefore, it is more harmful than we all thought. Okay. There's a lot going on here. And when I say a lot going on, I mean there's a lot that they're trying to make look like it's going on here. And this is a statistic that's quoted during a very busy and interesting visual, and it looks like, you know, the video production quality is really good. It's kind of funny to see test dummies smoking marijuana, okay? So it's easy to miss what she said. There are a few things I want to point out. The first thing is she said a roadside study. There was a little bit of fine print in the video, but it was not a citation. And I have no idea what study is being referred to here. They just say a study. I don't know if this is like 3 random cops who are comparing their notes at the end of the day. I don't know if this is a widespread multinational study where they're doing some sort of controlled experimentation. We just know that 1 in 3 reckless drivers who were tested in some random study, they tested positive for marijuana, okay? So that's kind of my first beef. If you're quoting a statistic and it's from a study and you say it's from a study, but you don't tell me what the study was so that I can go verify what you're saying, I'm going to assume you're trying to deceive me, and you should assume that too. The next thing that she said is 1 in 3. It's a pretty common thing to boil down these kind of percentages into numbers that make it sound more exaggerated than it really is. This is a third, right? 33%, however you want to say it. That's not much, you know? It's not like a majority, But a third may be a lot, I guess, considering how many drugs there are, that a third of them would be present, that a third of them would be marijuana specifically that's present. I'm always reminded when I see things like this, the one in that, or the this out of this many, that type of quotation. I'm reminded of the toothpaste commercials where they say, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend our toothpaste. And what I always think is, what you're saying is 20% of dentists do not recommend your toothpaste. So I want to know what they're thinking, you know? So it's just a way to draw attention away from the actual number and more to the kind of hidden point that they're trying to make. The next piece is this: reckless drivers who were tested for drugs. Okay, so they're not saying that 1 in 3 people who get in wrecks were high. They're not saying that 1 in 3 fatalities and accidents were caused by marijuana users. They weren't saying anything like that. They're just saying, hey, if the cop suspects that you are doing drugs and does a drug test, then 1 in 3 of those individuals who were tested for drugs, oh, lo and behold, they were on a drug. Is that surprising that they were on a drug if they thought they were on a drug? Okay. So there's nothing going on here. In my mind, there's nothing going on. And then she follows up with this, which is really where she crosses the line. And I don't know the voice actor. She probably has nothing to do with this. She's just paid to read statistics of her commercials. No big deal. But they say it's more harmful than we all thought. Okay. Did you know that? It was harmful. You thought it was harmful. And now we're letting you know that it is even more harmful than you thought it was. This is a very subtle way to implant an idea in your mind, even if it's not there. That we all, the kind of grouping us all together into some collective statement that you should be agreeing with just by watching Saturday morning cartoons, you know, that it's not at all tied to the statistics she gave. And it's more tied to the imagery of the commercial. So that's the kind of the key thing with this PSA, is the statistic is thrown in there to try to make something seem legitimate when what they're really trying to do is evoke an emotional response to a situation. So when you see the crash backwards, it's really interesting and engaging, so they have your attention. And then they show like those little snippets, this is what happens to your body when you're in a crash. And none of those things have anything to do with THC, right? Like if I were to get into a car accident on the way home today, those things would happen to my body too, but I've not been smoking marijuana. So the whole thing is disconnected, and they're trying to make a connection by saying the statistic over top of some emotional imagery. You need to be aware of this. This is a very common thing. All types of advertising does this. It's not just PSAs about drugs, it's also toothpaste commercials, it's alcohol commercials, any type of commercial really, and that's what PSAs are, they're commercials about the government. Okay, so where do we go from here? Drugfreeworld.org is a place where I went when I was trying to find statistics being used in opposition to something like legalized marijuana. I thought that I could go here and find some quotes about data that shows that cannabis is bad for you or something like that. What I found instead were a whole lot of stories. So I, as a statistician, well, I'm not really a statistician, as a statistics instructor, I need to make sure that you understand the difference between anecdotal evidence, which is basically somebody's story. It could be somebody on this video here, it could be your friend who smoked pot last week, it doesn't really matter. Those are not data. Data needs to be collected in a specific way so that it's representative of the whole population. If you don't go through some pretty important practices to standardize how you're collecting samples and how you're controlling experiments, then no result that you're getting is actually valid. When I was clicking through the Drug Free World website, I found a disturbing lack of citations. I thought that was notable. They use mostly imagery and stories in order to make a point. You can see that here. This is the webpage they have. It says The Truth About Marijuana. The reason I bring this up specifically is because when I was looking at other PSAs for other drugs like heroin and meth, I did see lots of cited research that talks about the harmful effects it has on the body. It was notably absent in the ones about marijuana. The only one I could find was the one I showed you, and we've already discussed how worthless that was, right? They have this neat little booklet that they have published. Now, this, again, the imagery is the important thing to notice here. Red and orange colors, this person in the background kind of puffing vapor in your face or something, and looks like she's out of it. The eyes are not being shown. These are all like psychological things. You may not notice this explicitly, but your brain kind of picks it out. Not seeing someone's eyes means you don't trust them. It's something that is subconscious about the imagery itself. And I was flipping through this booklet. This is a really cool booklet. I recommend you read it. And when I get to the point about the harmful effects of marijuana, this is probably not visible. They have a list, long and short-term effects, and they are casting them in a negative light because their objective is to create a drug-free world. They're very open with you about that, right? So all of these things, you'll notice, are missing something pretty important to me. What is this missing? Citations. I don't see any footnotes, any endnotes for any of these supposed long-term effects. And then short-term effects, some of them don't really make sense because we just heard from our researcher that marijuana has a calming effect, but they're saying it causes panic and anxiety. Okay, so either that means there's some invalid research going on one side or the other, or the panic and anxiety is some type of corner case or some other confounding effect going on. But we don't know because we can't look up their sources because they don't cite any. At the very end, they are nice enough to give a page of references, and most of these references are lacking an actual link to a full text where I could analyze the methodology that's being used. I was very disappointed. I was expecting to find some type of trail to follow so I can actually talk about data, because that's what I was asked to do today, talk about data and statistics and stuff. And what I'm ending up doing is talking about how there's really not a lot of data being quoted in at least the anti-marijuana discussion. Not a lot. Okay, so the second example I have is from the other side of the discussion. Here's a headline from a Washington Post blog. Christopher Ingraham. Marijuana may be even safer than previously thought, researchers say. Again, I'm being told that I thought marijuana was safe. And it's not just safe, it is even safer than we already thought. This is actually like in direct parallel opposition to what the quote from the PSA was. You notice that? It's even more dangerous than we thought. This one time we're seeing it's even safer than we thought. Again, this tactic of implanting an idea in your head before we even get to the data is at work, and this is a very common thing, especially in journalism, sensationalist journalism. So if we skip down, actually before I do that, let's talk about this word safe, safer. So when I think safe, I think about things that are advertised as safe, like one ski slope might be safer than another ski slope, and that means I'm less likely to die going down the ski slope. Or one car may be safer than another car, that means if I get into an accident, I'm more likely to be able to walk away. Or if I'm thinking about drugs, what does safe mean? If I'm thinking about drugs, my mind goes to, am I likely to die from it? Am I likely to suffer negative consequences from using it? Am I likely to get hooked on it? Those are things that are risky about drugs. And so if the headline is saying that marijuana is safe, then it's saying it is void or at least lacking most of those risks. Okay, that's fair. If we look into the article, we see what he really means when he says safe. Weed, roughly 114 times less deadly than booze, according to the authors, who ran calculations that compared lethal doses of a given substance with the amount that a typical person uses. Marijuana is also the only drug studied that pose a low mortality risk to its users. So these are the two things that are telling me what he means when he says safe. He's talking about dying from using marijuana. Did you think that was one of the side effects of marijuana use? You die from smoking too much pot? I don't think anyone has ever thought that. In none of the scary public service announcements did they ever show like a dead 13-year-old with a joint in his hand. No one thinks you die from doing this. What's going on here is this journalist, however you want to use that word, this journalist is making a case that doesn't need to be made. He's arguing a point where no one is fighting him on it. No one has ever said that marijuana is deadly, or at least no one who cited a source has ever said that marijuana is deadly. And so to come on the other end and to say, hey guys, marijuana isn't deadly, like it's some fantastic thing, isn't really doing anything except garnering readership from people who already agree with him, which is how he gets paid. I don't blame him for wanting to do that, but it's disingenuous to represent data from a legitimate research study. I looked at the study, it's pretty well ordered, and the researchers were not saying things in a sensationalist way like this headline does. So why would he do this? It's because his money comes from page views. It comes from clicks on people looking at his blog. It comes from him being a readable person and being hireable at the Washington Post. And that's all fine, but you need to be aware of it. You need to be aware that journalism, sensationalist journalism, like most journalism these days, is very prone to something called bias. I'm sure you've heard of bias before. And the important thing that I want you to understand is that I think the most important thing I want you to understand from my portion of this talk is that no one is immune from bias, no one. Both sides of the discussion about legalizing marijuana, they have biases. You have biases. You have a predisposition. You enter this room with an opinion, and you are more prone to standing by that opinion whenever you receive new data. This is something called confirmation bias, this particular thing that happens whenever we're presented with new information like a headline or a study or a PSA. You are more prone to interpret new evidence as confirming your own existing beliefs or theories. Each of you do this. Good-natured, people who want to know the truth, people who want to learn, want to be scholars, do this. You're not immune from it. This is Google's definition. That's pretty scholarly of me, right? So, as you go through your stint here at Wake Tech in post-secondary learning, as you go through life as a wannabe scholar, somebody who is wanting to know truth objectively, I encourage you to use data and to also be aware of the fact that no matter what the data says, you have a lens in front of your eyes that's coloring what you're seeing in a way that you would prefer to see it. You can't really escape it except to be aware of it and to try to fight it by asking yourself some critical questions. Just ask yourself, am I as likely to believe this study, even if it disagrees with something that I would prefer to believe. I've heard it said that the mind goes after or follows what the heart desires. So if you are here today because you desire one thing or another, you need to be aware that even good research is going to come through this lens that you have that's very likely to skew the way you think about it. That's it for my talk.
I'm Chris Gandy, by the way, assistant professor of philosophy over on the main campus, and I teach a lot of different classes, but primarily ethics, and I have for quite a while. And when I was asked to participate as part of this panel discussion today, I jumped at the chance, and then when I got home and had a second to think about it, I thought, maybe I shouldn't have done that. In that, it was something I suppose I myself had not spent a lot of time thinking about over the course of almost 20 years, not all of that at Wake Tech, but over the course of almost 20 years of teaching ethics. The topic of marijuana legalization or use, or all the, as I'll mention, a variety of issues associated with marijuana have come up in class, and people have very strong opinions, and I have opinions, which I won't share on the matter. But again, I wasn't necessarily thinking about it, and as I started to think, okay, well, how do I approach this issue? I realized that there really aren't that many issues specific to marijuana that are ethical issues, that most of the ethical issues that we tend to talk about could be issues associated with anything else. And so in trying to think of how to frame this talk and what I was going to talk about, I tried to find arguments that are being made that seem specific to marijuana. And I also tried to think about, okay, well, there's discussions about legalization, decriminalization. There are discussions about the history of marijuana, how these laws came to be, questions of racism, classism. I mean, there's a lot to potentially talk about. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to have to do something that we typically shouldn't do as critical thinkers or philosophers, and that's make an assumption for the purposes of the talk. And to try to narrow the scope and narrow the focus, given the time that we have, I thought I'm going to assume, which again, that's something we probably shouldn't do that frequently also, but I'm going to assume that the current trend towards legalization and decriminalization is going to continue, that we're not going to walk back from the direction we're heading in. And so rather than speak about the ethics of legalization or the lack thereof, et cetera, I want to focus on the end point, which is, a few years down the road when marijuana is legal everywhere, including here in North Carolina. The question then becomes, well, the set of questions perhaps gets a bit narrower. There might be questions about production, cultivation, distribution, sales, and I'll mention a few things about that in a little bit. But I think in the end, the question comes down to use. It comes down to the choice to use or not to use, and maybe more importantly, why a person might use. And so I want to limit the scope perhaps to talk a bit about that. I found, and again, in looking for sort of well-crafted and interesting arguments, ones that hold any kind of water, that can't immediately be shot down as being sort of silly and kind of reefer madness hysteria and all this kind of stuff. I found, too, that may still have something to them to consider, and so I'll bring those up. But the first thing I wanted to bring up, it actually, I suppose in some ways, piggybacks on something that James had just mentioned. The first ethical question I'd like you to consider is about the beliefs you have about marijuana. As he pointed out, we all come to the table with certain biases, certain preconceptions. We have beliefs that we've embraced, and we're very reticent to let go of those things. We like to see information that confirms it, and we tend to ignore information that doesn't. So if you're of the mindset, for whatever reason, that marijuana is even safer than you thought it was, and that's what you want to believe, then you probably will not spend much time looking at information that would disconfirm that. You might simply look the other way. And so I just want to mention a little, sort of a short story that's associated with this first question about the ethics of what we believe. And this is from a turn of the last century philosopher, William Clifford, and he said, imagine that you had a ship's captain who was about to set sail on a long voyage with a crew. And as the days, as it got closer to the time the ship was going to sail, he went down to the docks and he noticed that based on all the evidence he saw, that ship was not going to make it. It was going to sink, based on the evidence that he was seeing with his own eyes. But over the course of the next few days before the ship set sail, for a variety of reasons, he is able somehow to convince himself that no, it's got one more journey left in it. So part of that involves being able to somehow suppress whatever doubts he might have based on this evidence that he's seeing. So he sets aside these doubts that originally were very strong, but he's able somehow to overcome. He says, look, it's made it every time before. There's no reason to suspect it can't make it one more time too. Again, as I often mention in my ethics classes and critical thinking classes, think of how many times you've gotten into your car and turned the key, the needle is below E, and you think, I know I can make it. It's got just enough in it to get home, and maybe that's based on precedent. Maybe you've done that several times and conducted the experiment and gathered the data, and so you have a good sense, perhaps. Maybe it's wishful thinking. Maybe you're putting your trust in what Clifford called providence. You're hoping God will, eke out a few more bit of fumes to get you home. And so this ship's captain, this is what he does. He convinces himself, despite what the evidence seems to be indicating, the ship will make it. Of course, it sets sails, it sinks, everyone's killed. It's a sad story, I forgot to mention that. And so Clifford's question is this: morally, ethically, how would we judge this ship's captain? Well, it seems pretty clear-cut that he's negligent. He's responsible for the lives of his men that are on this ship. He, sets sail, the ship sinks, they die, he's accountable. But let's imagine just for a second that something different happened. There was a different outcome. Imagine that, miracle of miracles, the ship actually makes it. Despite every indication that the thing isn't going to make it, it somehow gets there. Just like you make it home on fumes. You didn't think you were, but somehow it happens. And so the question would be, okay, well, isn't he now in the right? He hasn't done anything wrong now because there was no harm. There wasn't a bad consequence. Clifford's point is no. He's not right. He just wasn't found out. If a person, let's say, takes out a pistol, points it outside the door and fires randomly, and luckily doesn't kill anyone, I think we could all appreciate, though, there's something still a bit unethical about what they did. They just got lucky. So in this case, the ship's captain just gets lucky. So what this leads Clifford to conclude, and the central point of this position that he takes is, it is always wrong, everywhere, for anyone to believe anything unless there is sufficient evidence to do so. And what he says this requires of you is that you have to recognize that it's your obligation to investigate your beliefs. So again, we all come to the table with particular beliefs about marijuana, feelings, impressions, intuitions, things of that nature. And so I think the very question of what we believe and how we come to those beliefs, that begins the question of ethics. As Clifford points out, our beliefs will manifest themselves as actions. We know that we can have beliefs and perhaps not even be consciously aware that they work themselves into our actions affect other people, etc. But more importantly, he says, if you're the sort of person who's willing to believe something based on insufficient evidence, you're setting yourself up, and I'm using a bit of different language here, you're effectively setting yourself up to be a sucker. You become the sort of person who's willing to believe anything once you start down that path. In other words, you're developing a bad habit, which is not investigating what it is you believe, merely accepting things. And so part of what I want to consider in terms of ethics, and there are different ways we can think of ethics, is the idea of what sort of habits we want to be cultivating. Good habits, overcoming bad habits, etc. Beginning with how we look at information, look at data, how we think about issues such as this. And so again, for Clifford, what we believe is an ethical issue, and that would include our beliefs about marijuana. And I'll come back to a bit more related to that in a little bit. I'd like to offer some anecdotal evidence, or information, I should say. I've taught for a while, as I mentioned. Marijuana has come up frequently in classes as part of discussions. And I feel safe in saying, based on my anecdotal information, if my fallible memory serves me well, that the vast majority of people in discussing marijuana, the vast majority of people that I've encountered, have been talking about legalizing marijuana for recreational use. And when they talk about medicinal value, therapeutic value, that is merely an ancillary concern and something they might use to bolster their argument for recreational use. Oh, and by the way, it's also good for you, that kind of thing. But really, they want to make the case that they should be allowed to simply use it for recreational purposes. So that's why I want to focus on that. Again, I may be generalizing. It's purely anecdotal information, but we had to narrow. I think I had to narrow the scope somewhat. So this is what I'd like to focus on then, is the question of use, assuming that the current trend continues towards legalization, decriminalization. But again, as I indicated in the beginning, there is a whole chain of events that precede the question of use. So when I first started thinking about it, I thought, okay, well, what about this funny little plant, marijuana? Given what we've just heard, the discussion really isn't about marijuana, of course. What the discussion is about primarily is THC. Really, the discussion is about the ethics of THC. If marijuana had none of the cannabinoids that it has, I doubt we'd be having this conversation. Stick around tomorrow. We're going to have a discussion about the ethics of pine trees. No interest, right? Yeah. If pine trees had THC, you'd be here, right? And if there were extra credit. But, so let's be, sort of open about this. There are certain compounds in this plant. Those compounds elicit a certain response in the human body. People like that response. They want to replicate that response. And so that's really what we're talking about here. Not the plant itself. Again, we talk about this frequently in my ethics class. There are reasons why we do things. There are consequences for what we do. But the action itself or the object at hand, that's typically attached to one or the other. We rarely talk about the ethics of an item itself, independent of these other considerations. So then the next question might be, okay, well, once marijuana, let's say, is legalized, what about the ethics of production? And again, I mean, this raises a lot of very serious issues. I can remember when I first moved to North Carolina in 2001, I had a student who was a tobacco farmer, and his family were tobacco farmers in Johnston County. They had been so for well over 100 years, and he said, we plant 40 acres of tobacco. When I'm not working the farm, I take classes at Wake Tech. He said, if I could plant 1 acre of marijuana, we could abandon the other 39 acres of tobacco. It would be better for the environment, better for the soil. We'd make far more money. I'd have far more free time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't use marijuana. He had no interest in it, but he saw all the values that came from it as an agricultural commodity, as a product, and so he was all in favor of it. So certainly there are ethical issues and questions about sustainability, sustainable practices, agricultural practices, the ethics associated with that, questions about land usage and water usage and efficiency and these kinds of things. But again, these aren't specific to marijuana. We would have the same discussion about any agricultural product, tobacco or lettuce or anything like that. So again, moving on then to try to isolate perhaps something a little bit more specific to marijuana. We might think then about, once the plant's grown, about distribution. And in this case, I mean from soil to, let's say, shop, or soil to distribution center. Again, the questions that might come up that are ethical questions are not specific to marijuana itself. The ethical questions are very similar to the sort of questions we might ask about anything. If you go to Harris Teeter to purchase a piece of fruit, and you pick up an apple and it's got a sticker on there that says that it came from Chile, that's a long way for an apple to travel. It's probably out of season here for apples, so it's shipped from halfway around the world. That certainly had an impact on the environment. And so there are lots of questions, ethical questions about our indulgence in such products, how they're grown, how they're distributed, et cetera. But again, we could ask the same questions of marijuana, but they're not specific to marijuana, but certainly part of this consideration. And again, for the ease of the discussion and to point to, or make a finer point, we might say, well, by the time it's legal everywhere, we'll have overcome many of these concerns. Like, for example, we can envision a day in which, just as you have restaurants that have gardens out back and it's a very sort of locally based food movement, You might have your local marijuana store that has it growing out back or something, and so we might overcome ethical questions of distribution, perhaps. Again, this is just speculation. And then we might talk about sale, when we finally get to the point where it's that last step before consumption. Again, many of these questions are ethical, but many are political. Many are purely economic questions. You know, for example, should marijuana be sold much in the way we sell beer? You go down to the local convenience store, you buy a six-pack, you buy your marijuana. It's treated in the same manner, perhaps. And so it would be, you know, Philip Morris, perhaps, that's selling you marijuana. It might be one of the other major tobacco companies. It might be a local company, a mom-and-pop operation. It might be Anheuser-Busch, who knows? But it would be some private corporation. Or should marijuana be sold much the way hard liquor is, through your state-sponsored ABC store? So they're in charge of its distribution and sale, which then raises questions of taxation, et cetera. So again, these are serious questions, but they're certainly not specific to marijuana. And in many cases, they take us away from the really ethical questions and perhaps moral questions. But they're certainly worth considering. Let's see. I know one question, for example, that came up, and this was partly a result of talking before the talk, and that is, you know, if you consider right now what the current blood alcohol level is for driving, how would you come up with something comparable for marijuana for when a person climbs behind the wheel? Questions of comparable levels of toxicity and things like that. Again, these are questions to consider, but maybe take us away from the question at hand. But then we have the question of the person who's doing the purchasing, and in this case, I mean the act of buying the marijuana. Again, I should have done this. I should have gathered some data and had some statistics and citations, but I heard this on the radio, so it has to be true. And I heard on the radio from what I believe to be a reputable source, but I'm biased, so who knows. But I had heard that up until very recently, the vast majority of marijuana that was used in this country was from Mexico. And I thought, okay, I've heard that frequently. That seems to make sense to me. But the reason why I bring that up is because, you know, in the time when people are purchasing marijuana locally that had its origins in Mexico, if you've been aware of, you know, the news and what's been going on in the world recently, the drug violence in Mexico is unprecedented. It's almost incomprehensible the number of people that are killed and die on a regular basis. When a person purchases drugs that have their origins in that drug trade, they are connected morally to that violence. They might not like that, they may disavow that, they may choose to not accept that, but it is what it is. You know, if you buy a shirt made in a sweatshop, you support sweatshops, whether you like it or not. You can, you know, put your head in the sand, it doesn't make it go away. But again, if it's true that most of the marijuana consumed now is from here, then perhaps we don't have to worry about those ethical concerns anymore. We're not connected to that. Just as people want to reduce our dependence on foreign oil, then we can break away from the violence associated with the Mideast and things like that. So that's the question of purchasing this product and what we support in purchasing that product and the ethical questions. But then finally we get to the question of use. And so, you know, to try to not present such a broad question, we might think, well, what are the reasons that people use marijuana? Of course, there are medicinal and therapeutic reasons, but I'd rather not focus on those. I think we would need an expert to comment on the relative merits and the efficacy of medicinal marijuana and things of that nature. But that's a particular use. There's a particular intention as to why a person does that. The reason why a person who suffers from glaucoma smokes marijuana would seem to be quite different from someone who merely wants to get high. Now, they might also want to get high in addition to whatever therapeutic benefits it might offer. There are certainly cultures for which the use of marijuana is sacramental. It's part of a religious experience. So that's a particular sort of use. Again, I think Joe might have to, a religious expert maybe would have to comment on that. I don't know about that. There are those who maintain that they use marijuana for purely reasons of productivity. It makes them more creative. It makes them more sociable. Outside of those intended outcomes, they have no interest in merely getting high. They want to be productive. They want something to come from it. So that's a pretty specific use. But then finally, you've just got good old, I just want to get high. And so in trying to look at and ask myself, are there any arguments left that a person could make that would say, here's why you shouldn't use marijuana. You shouldn't get high because it's unethical. What would those look like? This is what I was trying to find. Again, this isn't one of my intro to ethics class, and I don't want to turn it into that, so I won't mention the various theories necessarily. But of course, one way to assess use would be to do a simple cost-benefit analysis from what we might call a consequentialist perspective. What's right is based on the outcome. If using marijuana produces a greater amount of happiness and less suffering than not using it, then one should use it, perhaps. That would be a very utilitarian sort of view of it. Then there's another school of thought that says, well, what's right isn't a function of the outcome. What's right is a function of why you do it. This would be represented by the philosopher Kant, who I'll reference another way a little bit later. And so the question then becomes, well, what's a good reason for using marijuana? And we've mentioned just a few in passing. What's our motive? Why are we doing it, independent of any kind of outcome? And again, we could talk about this broadly or specifically, but that's another way of assessing it. And then finally, there's the method of ethics that's something probably many of you are familiar with. It's the way Wake County Public Schools teaches ethics, if you will. It's character education. This is Aristotle, classic virtue ethics. And so the question isn't what's right or wrong, but the question is more, what kind of person should we be? What qualities of character do we want to cultivate? What qualities of character should we avoid? And so in thinking about, I mentioned habits earlier, is the use of marijuana something that we want to become a habit? And the reason why I think that's the question is because I don't know how productive a discussion would be about the ethics of using marijuana once. I think that'd be a very short discussion. I don't know that most people have concerns about marijuana becoming legal and everyone trying it once. It seems the concerns would be that it becomes a habitual practice. And so the question of habit, I think, kind of moves to the front. But that's based on one view of ethics, which says ethics is all about determining right and wrong. And that's simply one way of thinking of ethics. Another way is a much older view of ethics, which is ethics is about the good life, the idea of living well and flourishing as a human. And so the question might be, well, how would the use of marijuana fit into that? In my picture of what it means to live well. And then again, finally, there's just simply a much more practical notion of ethics. Incarnate, as Tom had said, or you could use it responsibly and moderately. And again, that's a particular trait of character. And so there's that sense in which we could think about it. And then again, finally, there's just simply a much more practical notion of ethics, which is, the word ethics itself is from the Greek root word ethos, and ethos means habit. So in a very old sense, ethics is about cultivating certain kinds of habits. And so, again, I think the point of this, at least in the questions I have, is as you think about this, assuming that it's not going to be a one-time deal, I'm going to buy it that once and use it once and that's it, but you see it as something that may potentially be a habit, is that a habit that you want to cultivate? Is it a strength? Is it a weakness? What will it detract from, etc.? So these are maybe some of the considerations in an ethical sense. So I want to mention sort of one thing, and this is to kind of frame the first part of perhaps how we might look at this, and this is from the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who is known for two things primarily. One is for being a utilitarian, which I mentioned previously. That's the philosophy. He says what's right is whatever produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. But he's also the leading proponent of what we would call libertarian philosophy. And in his work on liberty, he has said, and I'll just read a short quote, "The sole end for which mankind is justified, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty or action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others." And it goes on, but the essential point is this. if what a person chooses to do does not cause harm to others, they should not be prevented from doing it. And he goes on to say, no society that claims to be free is truly free that does not recognize this principle. And so I came across an interesting article from an author named Damon Linker in a publication called The Week, and he pointed to this as well, and he said, again, what we see going on with marijuana is what we saw going on with the same-sex marriage movements and other movements, and they're all based in what he calls a type of moral libertarianism. He says, Americans increasingly believe that individuals should be free to do whatever they choose to do, as long as what they choose harms no one beside the person who consensually chooses to engage in it. And he says, once the solvent of moral libertarianism is applied to just about any contrary argument, that argument vanishes right in front of our eyes. In other words, if you accept the premise that people should be left alone to do whatever they choose, as long as what they choose doesn't harm others, what arguments remain against the use of marijuana? You know, and it seems intuitively pretty compelling. It seems hard to argue around that in some ways. So, you know, now this, I'm sorry. Okay. This leads to another question, though, and that's about the person who uses marijuana. Because one of the things that John Stuart Mill pointed out, and I'll just, again, read a brief quote, he said, it is perhaps hardly necessary to say that this doctrine of libertarianism is meant to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. We're not speaking of children or of young persons below the age that the law may fix as that of, in other words, legal adulthood. Those who are still in a state to require being taken care of by others must be protected against their own actions. So, being free to choose how to live does not apply to children. They are not sufficiently equipped to make such choices, and they must be protected. Well, this raises an interesting question. There are clearly many people who are legally adults, but who are insufficiently equipped to make choices in the world. Choices about how they should live as individuals and how others might live. And again, I mean, we know this. We have been these people at times in our lives. And so clearly there's a distinction between a legal adult and someone who is emotionally and intellectually mature enough to make such choices. And so one classic argument, one that still exists, is it's a political argument and an ethical argument. And politically we would call it paternalism. The government is your parent. And as any good parent, its task is to protect you. In many cases from others, but in many cases from yourself. Any good parent would prevent their child from sticking a fork in the light socket, right? I guess unless they practice tough love. Well, the government's like your parents, because in many ways, you're children. And you're incapable of making these choices yourself for a variety of reasons. So somebody's got to look out for you. As an example, in the late 1990s, the state of Montana had no daytime speed limit. They had what was called the Basic Law. And what the Basic Law said was during daytime in Montana, simply drive in a reasonable and prudent manner. Whatever that means. 3 years later in 1998, they brought back the speed limit. And the reason why they brought the speed limit back was because, first of all, the Supreme Court ruled that that law was just way too vague. But more importantly, it was way too vague in the sense that people left to their own designs were ill-equipped to determine what was reasonable or prudent. People lacked the requisite intellect to decide. And as an example, I mean, you know, we can imagine this. You know, if a person was driving down the highway in a Mercedes sedan that's been designed for the Autobahn going 120 miles an hour, they're a skilled driver. There seems to be perhaps nothing wrong with that. It seems reasonable and prudent. If the person is 16, driving a 1987 Toyota Tercel 120 miles an hour down the highway, that seems neither reasonable nor prudent. And so that was the point that they made. And so again, what that shows is that, you know, the best intentioned adults oftentimes, you know, are not reasonable and make poor choices. There's a current trend, and this was alluded to earlier by some others. A number of articles have been written recently, the New York Times and other sources, about what's called the and again, I mean to be provocative, but I mean no offense, and I'm merely quoting other people, so don't kill the messenger. A growing trend towards what's called the infantilization of the college student. That colleges are trying to turn college students into kids. Or more specifically, kids are requesting that. And what they offer as evidence of this are a number of things. There has been kind of an ongoing rash of speakers who have been invited to come speak at college campuses who are then canceled. Why? Because people are upset with their views and they don't want to hear their views. In other cases, some campuses have actually set up literal safe spaces on campus, places with pillows and videos of puppies, and I'm not making this up, this is from an article, and cookies and things like that. And the idea is that anytime a person encounters something that upsets them, they can retreat to the safe space. And as one young woman quoted, what sent her to the safe space was she attended a public talk and she heard ideas that were disagreeable to her own, and it upset her. In other words, these other ideas caused her trauma. They were dangerous. They were prickly and sharp, and she had to go to the safe space. And so there are a number of examples like this. The idea, and you know, the one video that I think you showed, it said something about there are going to be graphic images in this. Well, what they're calling trigger warnings now show up on syllabi and courses. Be careful, you may read something in here that you might take offense at. There may be something that might upset you, so watch out. And what the argument goes, what we're doing is creating a climate in which we're treating people like children. And in doing so, when they leave the bubble-wrapped college we're creating for them and go out into the prickly world, they're going to be ill-equipped for that. So again, this larger question of if this, and I'll just read this one quote that goes with this because I think it makes the point. This is from Eric Posner, who's a law professor at Chicago. He says that although universities protect students more than they used to, they necessarily do so because students are more childish than previous students were. And this is a direct quote. Perhaps over-programmed children engineered to the specifications of college admissions offices no longer experience the risks and challenges that breed immaturity, he wrote. But if college students are children, then they have to be protected like children. And if children should not be permitted to smoke marijuana, well, you know therefore what the conclusion of that might be. So the paternalistic argument, the protection argument, partly which is based in legal immaturity, but partly, or maybe perhaps more importantly, based in the idea that many people are ill-equipped to make, and the question here is perhaps not about actual use, but it's about the ability to make the informed choice to use. We know children can't give informed consent. And if we're redefining what it means to be a child, then that might mean that people who are a bit older are also not able to make an informed choice about something like use. Again, I merely offer this as an open-ended question. This is a strain of thought that's developing right now. Another strain of thought that's been around for a long, long time, but just won't go away, is a strain of thought that's based on the idea that the government has an interest in your soul, what's often called soulcraft. And a classic example of this is good old Socrates. Socrates was charged with being a corrupting influence on the kids. And when he went to the courthouse in Athens, he ran into a buddy of his, a guy named Euthyphro, and when Euthyphro said, "Why are you here?" and he said, "Well, they're accusing me of being a corrupter." And he said, "This guy that's accusing me, this guy Meletus, he's on to something here." He said, if he's right, and whether I'm doing it intentionally or ignorantly, if I am corrupting people, good for him. Because he said it is right for a leader to root out corruption and protect the youth from being corrupted. So if he's right, he's doing exactly what he ought to do. And so again, there's a strain of thought which says that the government should protect people from corruption, young and old alike, but perhaps start with the young. So in an article written in the New York Times last year by David Brooks, one of their columnists, an article called Weed, Been There, Done That, he made an argument along these lines. He said, my friends and I used to smoke pot, and we quit. But we didn't quit for all the reasons you're being told not to use marijuana. Yes, perhaps there are questions of addiction. Yes, perhaps there are medical concerns, et cetera. But he said that's not why we quit. We just kind of grew out of it. But he gave 3 indications as to why perhaps they grew out of it. He said, for one thing, quote, stoned people do stupid things. He said, when I was stoned, I did stupid things. And he can still recall a time from 4th grade when he made a fool of himself. I'm sorry, not 4th grade. Actually, he doesn't say. He just says in English class. It was, the number 4 was in there. So, he says the other reason was that a member of our clique, one of our close friends, became, quote, a full-on stoner. He dropped out. He had such promise. You can understand where this argument goes. He was such a bright young man, etc., and then he dropped out and became a full-on stoner. But he said the other, perhaps the primary reason is most of us developed what he called higher pleasures. This is a strain of thought that's been in philosophy for an awful long time, and it comes down, and John Stuart Mill is a proponent of this, and what it says is this: humans are capable of 2 different types of pleasure. We have the capacity for animalistic pleasures, which we share with all other non-human animals. Sexual pleasure, the gratification of food, etc., that feels good to us in the same way that sex feels good to a pig, or food feels good to a cow. But because we have these massive brains, we also have the capacity for intellectual pleasures. And those are the pleasures we find in aesthetic enjoyment, the arts, morality, believe it or not, the pleasure that goes with, calculus and science and things like that. There is an intellectual pleasure. And what Brooks' point is this. He said, given that we have the capacity for these higher pleasures, we shouldn't gravitate towards the lower pleasures. And he goes on to say that when a government legalizes marijuana, what they are doing is de facto encouraging people to use it. All the evidence seems to indicate that once it goes legal, the price goes down and usage will go up, which means more people will use it. And is that the thing we want to cultivate? Do we want our government cultivating in people the effort to gravitate towards what many would consider a lower pleasure, rather than what he calls subtly encouraging people, i.e. laws, punishments, to not use marijuana and instead focus on the higher pleasures? So this is an argument that's been around for quite some time. It's apparently still out there. But it runs 2 courses. One is based on this distinction between the higher and lower pleasures. Partly it goes back to, an argument that Kant also made. Imagine this, and I'll wrap up really quickly. Think about somebody who does something terrible but profits from it. Like, think about a bad guy who's out there enjoying life, fat and happy and profitable. Most of us don't like to see that. We like to see hardworking, good, decent people do well, but not bad people. And Kant said there's a reason why we feel that way. Because what this person does is, again, we don't like to see people who cater towards the lower elements of what it means to be human do well in life. We don't like to see them happy. And so it goes back to this idea, perhaps, that when people gravitate towards lower pleasures like getting high, and they're immensely happy from it, it gives us that same feeling. Another argument similar to that is, again, sort of, says that there are certain things in life you should find great enjoyment from. Heroism, sacrifice, creation, things like that, not, getting high, which produces a very similar sort of feeling. So again, these are 2, and one of the points I think that Brooks makes that's a good point, not that I necessarily agree, but he says, most of the arguments about marijuana use focus on questions of possible harmful effects, economic concerns, legal concerns. No one wants to talk about the moral question of whether or not one ought to use it. Because what that seems to imply is that there are some ways of living our lives that are better than others and worse than others. And as soon as you start talking about that, you offend people right away. And it's a tough issue, and no one wants to talk. And I think he's right about that. I mean, I think when you try to focus on the purely moral arguments, you're forced to wrestle with questions like, should one live that way? And of course, we know that could be very divisive. Let's see. I'll mention maybe one final point, and this relates to the earlier point regarding this safe world that we're creating. And this is from a psychotherapist, Howard Samuels. And he says, you know, I've been practicing psychotherapy for a long time. I don't believe in legalization, and I don't believe in using marijuana. And this is anecdotal. This is based on his experience, but there's no data. He says, what I found is that most people who smoke marijuana do it to self-medicate. Yes, there are those who do it to experience pleasure absent any problem, but most people do it in response to a problem. They feel bad, they have anxiety, they're suffering, they have a physical injury, so they're self-medicating. And in the cases of the sort of stuff that he deals with as a psychotherapist, emotional trauma, these are people who are not dealing with their problems in a manner that's going to serve them well, i.e., you don't deal with PTSD by getting drunk or getting high. That's not going to serve you well. But that's what people do when they take this shortcut to try to medicate themselves. And I think you could add that into the earlier arguments, which again we all know that dealing with tough emotions is difficult. It's something that we like to avoid. You know, if you're in a relationship and your significant other has said, we need to have a talk. No one wants to have that talk. You know what it's going to be and you know where it's going to go, and so we try to avoid that. Again, in trying to avoid what's difficult, does that do us a service or a disservice? And so I would have us perhaps consider that as well. Again, as with any philosopher, I could go on and on. I'm sure I've already gone excessively long, but thank you for your time.
How does marijuana affect communication in a relationship? Who would like to take that? This is safe for me. I don't have to answer.
How do you think it affects communication in a relationship?
Well, I'm not going to say because it's not legal, so...
I don't think science can answer that question.
Well, I'll ask the same question. Hypothetically speaking, if one were to use an illegal substance and attempt to communicate, what do you think? Hypothetically speaking, of course. I think you already have an answer. No?
Okay, so someone up there has the answer. Might it boil down to the attitudes that each of the parties that are communicating might have about marijuana? Did I steal your thunder?
Not really. When you talk to somebody who's high, they tend not to remember you tomorrow, so why did you waste your time?
Thank you very much. Do we have another question from... Okay, we have one here, and then I see there's a question down here. So if we have another microphone, perhaps we could move over here so we can move more quickly with the questions. Yes?
So then, what will be the way forward if we can pay attention to the moral implication of using marijuana? Thank you.
So the question was, how do we move forward if we can't focus on the moral question? Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, I think the point that Brooks brings up is a good point. It's difficult, we know, but at the same time, I think most of us already think in a manner in which we recognize that some ways of living are better than others. I mean, I think that's part of the way we think about things. You know, if I were to offer you the opportunity right now to, you know, never be able to see again, most of you would never take me up on that offer because you would not prefer to live that way. You would prefer to live perhaps the way you do now. And so, again, I think we recognize that we prefer some ways of living to others. Talking about it, of course, is difficult because, of course, it requires maybe that we judge other people and their choices. But if we go back to the original idea that maybe the best that we can hope for is people make good choices because they're thinking about it and asking the right questions and seeking out information, I mean, that may be the best we can hope for, is increasing awareness, questioning, research, gathering information, and in the end, we know that it's up to them. If I had a specific answer, I'd win the Nobel and retire.
I think our next question is right here.
I have two questions, actually. The first one is, what is the correlation between marijuana and Alzheimer's and schizophrenia?
Okay, I think that that's still being explored. Oh yeah, what is the relationship between Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, and marijuana? I think that that question is still being explored. I mean, there are people who say, or you've probably heard, that marijuana contributes to schizophrenia. I mean, the best evidence that we have right now is that people who become schizophrenic after smoking marijuana were probably already had risk factors for schizophrenia. The extent to which marijuana may act as a trigger is something that's still being explored. And I'm not as familiar about the Alzheimer's research.
And also, are there any side effects to wearing the clothes made with hemp?
None that I know of, unless you're allergic to them.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yes.
My question is, do you think that the infantilization of the college student also extends to policymaking that could affect the general public?
So the question is, while they're conferring over who will take it, is do we think that the infantilization of the college student might also extend to policy making that would affect the general public in some way? So are we infantilizing the public, in a sense? Is that your question?
What do you think? And I honestly don't mean that rhetorically. I think you have an impulse. I mean, you have a particular belief about that already. So, I mean.
I tend to agree that, I don't know, in terms of perspectives available, college students tend to be insulated from, you know, like the business world. And I think there might be a move toward, I think that the more, in a way, the more laws you have in place, the less people have to think, so the less responsible people are inclined to be with increased legislation. But on the other hand, as you related, you know, people in general have demonstrated that they can't be trusted to make reasonable and rational judgments per situation.
Some people, surely, but does everyone remember the infamous McDonald's coffee incident? Hot coffee, woman's lap. I mean, for many people, that's kind of emblematic of the question you're raising and of that issue. And so, the question then is, well, where is the fault in a case like that? I think you by answering that, you sort of answer your question. So.
In some ways, I think that people should be left to govern themselves, but then again, there are individuals in the world who actively seek to harm others, so there have to be measures to protect people from each other and from themselves in some cases.
I agree. Hey,
I'm right. Okay. Okay, so I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So I see a hand all the way in the back. I see one down here, and we have a question here. So we'll try to get to at least those who have the microphones, and then we'll try to get to you, and then down here to you. Is that good? Okay, so we'll try to do it that way. So the next question is over here. Yes. Oh, it's up there. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
So towards the end of the
If you could hold your microphone a little bit closer.
So towards the end of the discussion, you were talking about kind of like higher and lower forms of like involvement with things, and it seemed like marijuana was kind of like seen as like one of the lower involvements, but I feel like that. Do you think that that's like a status way of thinking? Like, because if you have higher status, then you can afford to like engage in the arts and reading and all those kinds of extracurricular activities. But something like marijuana may be more accessible to somebody who is lower income or lower status, and that might be like a luxury that they might be able to afford. And then what do you feel about like that discussion?
I'll take that one, even though I'm the brain person here. I think that you seem to have some views yourself, but I'd like to recommend a book to you by Carl Hart Jr. He's a neuroscientist who's written a book kind of looking at that kind of issue. He's also a neuroscientist. I think you might find that a very interesting book.
Please, I really want to know the take-home message from this symposium, if I may call it, because we are told that you can individually take a decision to consume marijuana. And then, if you do that, what happens to the ripple effect of your action to the general public?
So the question is, I think stating the point of view that maybe what we do does not or does have effects on the general public even when we think it doesn't. Is that correct? But it ripples out regardless how minor the ripple might be.
Yes, going from what he said, that an individual can consume marijuana to his own discretion. Then, what if the person is affected? What is the result of his action to the neighbor by his side?
Chris, do you want to take a stab at that?
The person that I referred to, William Clifford, who argued that we had an obligation to investigate, one of the points that he brought up was much of the confusion on, I think, an issue like this is based on the idea that even what we believe we believe that how we behave is a private affair unless it affects others, and we believe that what we think is a private affair because thinking is different from action. And the point he made was that there's no such thing as a private belief. You've gathered your beliefs from multiple sources, from a history and a legacy. You're going to pass that on to future generations. So what you believe and how you acquire your beliefs is something you have to be very mindful of, because you're creating a legacy for future generations of either soundly acquiring your beliefs or becoming gullible, so to speak. And again, when Mill argued that from a libertarian perspective we ought to be able to do what we do as long as what we do doesn't harm others, the question then becomes, is harm occurring? I think many people speak of things like victimless crimes and actions for which there are no consequences or which do not harm others, but all it would take I think would be a little bit of investigation to see what the consequences of our actions are and how our use or practice of something would affect others and affect others. And so I think that would require just simply a type of awareness and investigation to see that there are rarely any events that occur in isolation that don't have some sort of impact.
Very much, but if I may crave your indulgence.
I need to cut it off because I promised 3 more people that they would have a chance to ask a question. I do want to say that our panelists will remain here, and you are perfectly free to come up and talk to them once we have adjourned the meeting. And I hope that you will come up and ask questions. So, who has the next question? Up in the back? Who has the microphone? There it is. Okay, we need to get the microphone up there. Okay, yes, and then we'll come down to you after that.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, sorry, trying to get the spacing right, but assuming it's made properly and everything, assuming that like there's no butane left in the final product or anything like that, do you guys think that butane hash oil is more or less like detrimental to the body than actually smoking the flower itself? Like assuming that it's all made correctly.
Yes. I think that the question is whether using butane to get the resin or the THC out of the marijuana is more dangerous than using the plant itself. I would say it probably is, because butane is not very good for the body.
Okay, thank you. Our next question right up here.
This is for the math teacher, math professor, sorry. How do you think that legalizing marijuana is going to hurt the innovation of mathematics in terms of like differentials and discrete analysis and higher levels? Well, do you think Sir Isaac Newton smoked?
Well, I did take, do I need to repeat the question? Do I think Sir Isaac Newton smoked is the question. I did take a course in grad school called History of Mathematics. It was fascinating. And there was no discussion in that class about whether or not cannabinoids were used by mathematicians. And with no personal experience of my own, I cannot actually comment on whether or not the future of mathematics will be pursued or furthered or hindered by widespread marijuana use. I'm sure that's not very satisfying. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's pretty satisfying.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you guys for enlightening us on stuff we maybe didn't know about this marijuana situation. Not represented here is the pharmaceutical industry. Not represented here is lobbyists for the pharmaceutical and the political ramifications behind the legalization of marijuana. I did hear someone mention that 23 states legalized this marijuana. And it put me in the mind of prohibition. I mean, that stuff, we all familiar with prohibition and how alcohol came about to become legal. And it had all the same properties, the disadvantages. I don't want to say advantages, but I still can't think of none, other than just enjoy being high and drunk. But with marijuana, now it was explained to us the medical ramifications, the medical benefits of marijuana. And my question is, you know, could someone on this panel address the political ramifications? You know, me personally, I think they're not legalizing it or hindering the legalization of marijuana because they haven't yet found a way or figured out how to tax it, like they did cigarettes and alcohol. I mean, we have manufactured synthetic drugs, and it's been proven that marijuana is just as beneficial. So my question is, what's with all the issue, the political, the pharmaceutical, what is all the hype about marijuana?
So the question is then, what are the political ramifications or implications? We need Congress. Yes. Would either of you like to address that? The political ramifications of legalizing marijuana?
Controversial, but political ramifications of legalization or decriminalization. So you think you're kind of in favor of it, is at least decriminalization?
I don't care one way or the other. My time with smoking herb is over. So I don't really but my point is, I mean, we do pharmaceutical medication. Every day is a new drug on the market. Every day, every commercial is a new
Yes, there are new drugs on the market that have gone through the FDA and safety practice and things like that. And a lot of the things that are said about marijuana in terms of medicinal may or may not be true. And I think the important point here is there are some things that you have to make your own decisions about. One of the issues with deciding about medical marijuana is there's really, despite the fact that it's been around a very, very long time, there's very little research Because if you schedule a drug as Schedule 1, and by default, being Schedule 1, it doesn't have any medicinal use, it kind of curtails the medical research on what you can do to test it. And so I think that some of the questions about whether or not it really truly is a medicine and what effects it does have beyond the anecdotal kind of thing that you get is still being researched. And in terms of the political consequences or political ramifications, I'm sure that there are a lot of them, and I think those are the kinds of things that, you know, you as the future generation are going to have to look at those issues and think about, well, what is your opinion and what do you think should happen, and then, you know, start to act to make that happen.
Just one quick comment on that, an article I read this morning on, I think the same one that Mr. Duty read, from the North Carolina House of Representatives. A member of the committee that killed the bill for medicinal marijuana, or the legalization thereof, noted that from his perspective, he thinks it's coming, but the issue in the current legislature is that many of the people who are writing the laws, writing the bills, deciding the laws, are of a generation kind of like us that grew up in the Vietnam era and so forth with negative views of marijuana. So they may well say, like you just said, my days of smoking weed are over. But he thinks a younger generation of legislators is going to have a different opinion. So it's kind of a wait and see, I think, what the political implications are going to be on that. With that said, I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight to listen to our speakers, and I'd like you to give them a round of applause and thank them for being here.
I want to thank the speakers that took part in today's event. I have some thank you cards for each one of you. Mr. Duty. Thank you. Dr. Wilder. Thank you. Mr. Hedges. With that said, now Ms. Norton will explain how to sign up for extra credit.
So, wow, thank you very, very much for being here this evening. I'd also like to thank our speakers for coming in and sharing such really amazing perspectives and very different ways of thinking about this very controversial topic of marijuana. When we started planning this event last fall, we knew there was an interest. We had no doubt about that. The room is cleared out a little bit, but I have never seen this room so full. We had no idea just how many people would come out to this event, and we appreciate everyone who came out, all of our students, but also so many of our faculty came out today and supported. And this can't just be for extra credit to have this good of a turnout here. And so I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you. Thank you for spending your time with us this evening, and thank you for coming, and hopefully have lots of ideas and ways to think about this issue and many other controversial issues from lots of different perspectives, because that's what it really requires. And so right outside in the hall, for those of you who are receiving extra credit, there's a table with the sign-up sheet, so just make sure you sign in, pick up the handout, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. Yes. Yay.